And we will see, what do we see on the old interwebs, and see if they've actually got us live indeed. So, good morning, little TeaFlix folks.
Hello, friends.
Tuesday warriors.
Hope you're all ready to rock. Off we go again, another week nearer Christmas. Should we get the tree down, Martin?
Oh, God. I know, it's crazy.
Well, I've started getting Halloween and, God knows what.
Oh, yeah.
Mail now. It'll be Easter eggs anytime.
That's right. We'll be getting Valentine's stuff through the mail.
Yeah, I know.
So we're excited today to continue on our Beatle author series. This young man was turned on to us by our dear friend from Sirius XM, who was a recent guest, Tom Frangione, and he actually wrote the foreword to this fabulous book that Ange has just finished reading over the Labor Day weekend. So I get my hands on it next. And there it is, The Beatles, Fab But True. Remarkable stories revealed, and we will be discussing some of those today. So our guest today is an attorney by day. Doug Wolfberg combines a lawyer's disciplined research skills and inquisitiveness with a litigator's flair for sparkling storytelling into a labor of love that tells incredible Beatles stories in a fun and breezy read. Doug has traveled on multiple occasions to key Beatles historical sites in the UK and elsewhere. As a musician himself, he's also performed at the Cavern Club in Liverpool, spent time inside Abbey Road's famous Studio 2, and he's met Beatles and close associates, and he's even jammed with the Beatle. So he's collected pieces of Beatles history, and his goal in writing this Fab But True book was to bring to life key Beatles stories that have fallen through the cracks of history and been swallowed by myths over the decades. So without further ado, and the crowd goes wild for our guest today, author Doug Wolfberg.
Hello, Doug. Good morning.
Hello, Angie. Hello, Ruth. It's so great to be here.
Absolutely.
Good, nice to have you.
Thanks for taking the time.
Yeah,
absolutely. So I think I covered sort of most of it in the intro, but you know, the real thing is how on earth did you get the idea and the inspiration? Because there are so many books on the Beatles. Where did you get the aha? I found a niche.
Well, you're right. The world is a crowded Beatles bookshelf. And, you know, I had heard these stories from various sources over the years, things I've read, people that I had talked to. And I thought, you know, nobody's really drilled down on some of these just fascinating backstories and some of these incredible characters. And I'm like, why don't we know more about some of these people that played these integral roles in some of these stories and in their careers? And so it started from my curiosity. And the more I dug down onto some of these events, into some of these people, I was just fascinated at how colorful some of these folks were. And I thought these stories would leap off the page. So that's kind of how it happened for me.
Yeah, I was fascinated by images of a woman painting that they all did. I didn't know anything about that.
Oh, yeah, in Japan.
Yeah, thank you for starting with that, because that is really my favorite story. That's my elevator pitch when I do, when people ask me about the book.
Yeah.
And what's really cool, let me grab my prop here. So you had your copy of the book. This is mine. But yeah, so on the inside, I've got notes from a prior interview. Okay, so on the inside of the front cover is a picture of this painting that you're talking about.
Yeah.
Yep.
And it's called Images of a Woman, and it's quite abstract. And I was grateful that the publisher used it in the way they did in the inside cover. But there's a whole chapter about how this came to be. So when the Beatles went to Japan on their 1966 tour, which became their final tour, there was a furor going on in Japanese society, especially in Tokyo, because they were the first Western artists to play at the Budokan, which was the sacred, martial art site.
Right.
Now we're so used to everyone at the Budokan, right? I mean, Cheap Trick had one of the biggest live albums in history at the Budokan. But the Beatles broke the seal, as it were.
Uh-huh.
And there were real protests going on in Tokyo when they landed there in 1966. So the authorities more or less confined the Beatles to their suite in the Tokyo Hilton. And while they were under house arrest or whatever you want to call it, the promoter of the show, who was a guy named Tats Nagashima, who had been educated in the West and had booked Western acts at officers' clubs, after the war, and, knew Western music, brought them canvases and paints to pass the time while they were sort of confined to their quarters, as it were.
Yeah, bit like an MBS vacation in Saudi Arabia, right?
Yeah, exactly.
Get locked in the Ritz-Carlton.
Good analogy. So so when they were in the suite, they were allowed to go out and play the shows. They played a series of shows over 3 days. And interesting, what I found so many things about the story fascinating. One is that they were such creative souls that even though the circumstances were bad, they couldn't go out and see sights or do anything.
Right.
They were really, people who were there in articles and interviews said that they were almost obsessive, about getting back to work on the painting. They were just so, they wanted to create, fine, let's, show's done, let's get back to the painting.
Right.
And there's great pictures in the book of the 4 of them working collaboratively on this painting. And there's a table lamp right in the middle so they can see what they're doing. And that's the big circle in the middle of the painting.
Wow.
And they each signed their name adjacent to their contribution. So it's just so telling. It says so much about them that in the middle of this chaos, the eye of this hurricane, that they just found serenity in their own creativity and passed the time by this, creating this collaborative work of art. And it's really, other than a postcard and some walls and ceilings at the Casbah Club, it's the only time that they ever collaborated on a work of visual art. So it's quite a fascinating story.
If I'm right, I heard a rumor. Now, it disappeared for years and wound up with the Japanese fan club secretary, didn't it?
That's right. It actually, there's some differing accounts, but it did end up in the hands of the Japanese fan club. I think it might have been the fan club president, but either way, it was an officer of the fan club. And then it surfaced and it was sold to an owner of some theaters in Japan who, it was nicely framed. It sort of sat under a bed for about 50 years. He would bring it out for TV interviews and whatnot. Then it was auctioned in 2012 for about $150,000, which I imagine would only be the deposit on what it would be today if it went up on the market.
Absolutely. Wow. Do we know where it is now, or has it disappeared into history again?
Well, as far as I know, as far as my research showed, the purchaser of it at the last auction in 2012 is still the owner. Okay. And I think that purchaser was undisclosed.
Oh, okay. Yeah, well, maybe that purchaser is watching from Southern California. You never know. Yeah. Or Alabama. You never know.
You never know. And it's great, because it's such, and, they did call it Images of a Woman, but, there's no images of a woman anywhere plainly visible on the in the picture. But so
all in the mind.
Well, maybe
all in the mind. It's very
it was a woman who was bringing them water and paintbrushes, and because when you're painting, it's a messy thing, and I wouldn't imagine in the 60s that Japanese culture would have a male cleaning up after these 4 long hairs.
Good point.
Maybe it's dedicated to the poor gal from room service who had to clean up the mess. You never know.
I love that theory. Boy, that's going to have to be a follow-up in the next book. I'll have to figure that out.
We just created a whole new rumor right here on TeaFlix. Boy, oh boy. So I was also interested in the story about the racehorse because, as you probably know, Drake's Drum was my dad's racehorse that Paul bought him, and it loops back into the painting story. When my dad turned 64, which unbelievable. I mean, I thought he was such an old man. And my next birthday, God willing, is my 64th. And he went down to London to an event that Princess Margaret was at, and a whole bunch of mucky mucks, and the Beatles were being given something. And at midnight on July 6th, it turned to Jimmy Mac, my dad's birthday, July 7th. And Paul brought him this big wrapped brown flat paper package. And my dad unveiled it, and it's a picture of a horse, and it's huge. And my dad said, well,
thanks, son. It's very nice.
It's a very nice horse. He said, well, I haven't bought you the bloody painting.
I've bought you the bloody horse. And it's running in the Hilton Plate at Aintree. So
it's running in Liverpool next Saturday.
Jim never dreamed he'd own a racehorse, in his early days when things were tough.
And so the fact that we're discussing painting and then racehorses, kind of there's so many parallels in the Beatles lives and names and people and songs and stuff. So I was just fascinated with the racehorse story in the histories. Tell us about that from your perspective.
Yeah, that's a great tie-in and great story about your dad's horse. But yeah, so this story goes back to the 50s, and it involves a woman named Mona Best, who was the mother of Pete Best
And Rogue.
and Rogue and Rory, and so Mona was really sort of one of the original boosters of the Beatles. She was the mother hen of the Beatles in the early days.
Absolutely.
and really filled the role of getting them some bookings. And and the story I tell in the book is that this was at a period of time when success for the Beatles was far from assured, right? This was the period of time when paid gigs were few and far between. And, what are you going to do with your life is the question that keeps coming up. They're all having to make that decision, that existential decision about, are we going to really make a run at this, try music, or should we be sensible and get jobs? And everybody who's ever picked up an instrument has had to make that. Now you can see, I became a lawyer, and, I would ask your viewers to just picture that instead of, legal stuff behind me, there's guitars and fun things. That's what my home office looks like, but it's working hours, so here I am. So obviously, some of us go the sensible route and go to school, get jobs. So the Beatles were at that crossroads, and finding paid gigs and keeping people in the band, and all of those things. So Mona had put her eye on this stately house in West Derby in Liverpool.
Yep.
And she was married at the time to Johnny Best, who was a boxing promoter.
Yep.
And from all accounts, a bit of a domineering figure. And Mona wanted this house. Johnny said no. Mona had come from a family of some privilege in India.
Yeah.
Some heirloom jewelry, and hawked it. What we, here in the States, took it to a pawn shop, got some money for it, and went and bet on a horse in the Derby Stakes. And she bet on this horse called Never Say Die, simply because she said she liked the name and she thought it suited her spirit. And so the horse was a 33-1 long shot. So it was the worst odds of the whole field. But, she just liked the name and bet her money on Never Say Die, which is ridden by Lester Piggott, who went on to become a famous jockey in
Queen's jockey. Mm-hmm.
And it was his first big win. So Never Say Die actually wins the Derby and pays Mona handsomely. She buys back her jewelry, I'm sure for a nice premium, and goes and buys this house. And in the basement, she decides that she wants to put a club so her teenage sons will have a place to hang out. There's no alcohol. It's a coffee club. So she names it the Casbah Coffee Club. Yeah. And really, even before the Cavern, it's where the Beatles
absolutely
were given this paying gig that was, it just seems to me at the time where they were in their career and in their lives and at the age they were, it was a lifeline for them, having that paying gig. Right. And so I sort of see it as drawing a straight line between a horse and the birth of the Beatles, or the survival of the Beatles.
Which then gave Paul enough money to buy his own father a horse. So, and the circle closes, right?
It comes all back to another horse.
Yeah. And Karen, our friend from Edinburgh, who's just been to Liverpool, he's saying that Drakestrom wound out his days in High Park Farm in Campbelltown, Macrahanish, where Paul and Linda's Scottish farm, which is correct. And Ashley, our friend from Birmingham, is saying it's the best family motto: never say die.
Never say die. And God loves a trier is the other one.
God loves a trier. I don't know if it's their family motto, but it's ours. But yeah, no, it's one of the greatest stories of all time, isn't it? 33-1 odds. Oh. And then there you are. So without Lester Piggott winning that horse and Mona having the money to buy the Casbah, who knows?
And I should note, by the way, that Never Say Die was American bred, and it was very unusual to have an American bred filly in the Derby Stakes. So
yes,
not that we're staking our claim here in the States.
Oh, yes, you are. Come on, admit it.
And staying in the West Derby Walton Village area, This is a good
Oh,
one.
I also enjoyed your Eleanor Rigby story. Perhaps you'd like to re-relate that for our viewers.
I would. And this story is, I think, a little bit better known among the stories that are in there. But I had a great opportunity to interview Rod Davis, who was one of the Quarrymen, right around the time Paul joined, actually. Rod was still in the band. And talk about a spry octogenarian. We had to reschedule the first interview because he was busy windsurfing. So what a great guy. So I had an opportunity to speak with him and just get some firsthand accounts of that day. But so what this all goes back to is, of course, we know in 1966, Paul writes Eleanor Rigby, which is just a seminal work, for a lot of reasons. One, because the Beatles are not playing any of the instrumentation, so that's a first in any of the Beatles recordings. But secondly, it's such a departure from songs about holding hands and love and it's a song about lonely people and loneliness. So it's such an amazing composition.
Yeah.
And Paul was asked, as the two of you I'm sure well know, back at the time in interviews, who's Eleanor Rigby? Where did you get the name? What was the inspiration?
Yep.
And Paul said, well, I created the name. I like the name Eleanor because the actress Eleanor Braun had appeared with them in the movie Help.
That's right.
Yeah.
And he was walking with Jane Asher one day and saw a sign, Rigby and Evans. And he liked the name Rigby. So he put the two together. And in interviews throughout the years had always maintained that was where he came up with the name.
Yeah.
Well, in the 70s, somebody discovers a headstone of a grave in a cemetery in Liverpool, and it has the name Eleanor Rigby on it.
Yeah.
But what really makes this story, I think, the most cosmic story in the whole book is that the particular cemetery is at a particular church in Woolton, in the suburb of Liverpool, at St. Peter's, which is where John's band, the Quarrymen, was playing in July of 1957 at the Woolton Village Fete.
Yep.
And that is the day that Paul and John are introduced to one another. And it is mere yards. It's across the street from the cemetery, just yards from where Eleanor Rigby is buried in the church social hall across the road is where they met. But it can't be more than, 100 yards, if that, from where she's buried. So
I went back there in the 90s with filmmaker Ken Barker, a friend of ours from Atlanta, who's also a big Beatle collector and vinyl dealer. And we started a documentary called Here, There, and Everywhere. And we went and interviewed people. Like, we still have the last interview of Cynthia Lennon, Neil Innes. I was the last person to interview Billy Preston. We did that when we came back. And of course, during our time at Bob Wooler, Billy Hatton from The Foremost, we got them all of these stories on tape. And of course, being there with an American film crew, I said, well, let's go and do all of the spots. So St. Peter's, Woolton Village Hall was one of the stops. And the story back then in the 90s was kind of leaking. It was right at the very beginning of the internet. And I had sort of heard that this Eleanor Rigby gravestone was supposed to be somewhere in St. Peter's. So we went looking for it, and son of a gun, there it was. And it's probably, honestly, because there were a bunch of typical Scousers, there were a bunch of cigarette butts in the graveyard. So my posit is that they probably, after the gig, you couldn't smoke in the village hall because they were all underage. They probably went back in the graveyard for a quick ciggy. Or a beer and a Coca-Cola or what have you, and subliminally somewhere walking around he's taken a flash of that name. It's gone in the back of his mind, and it wasn't until years later that it came up again.
Yeah, and that's consistent with what Paul himself has said. So he said, look, I may have seen that, it may have been planted in my mind. I know I put the name together with these two other.
Such an unusual combination. It's not John Smith, right?
That's right. And so I did a little digging. A lot of folks know the story about the headstone being found in that particular cemetery.
Right.
I searched some public records, did a little bit of digging about the real Eleanor Rigby. Mm-hmm. So she was married, so she wasn't a lonely old person, but she was childless, and she did die pretty young. sadly. So,
Our New York street team leader, Elizabeth Carbone, is asking if anybody on knows if Eleanor Rigby is related to the McCartney/Campbell's and ancestry. She's heard a story that somewhere back the Rigby was Campbell, and somehow the Campbells and the McCartneys were related. I have not heard that one, but if anybody knows, please do put it in the chat. That would be very interesting to know, because that would be another weird tie, that if they were like fourth cousins 3 times removed or something.
That would make it the most cosmic story ever, I think.
Isn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. And Karen from Edinburgh is saying Eleanor Rigby's house was within a 30-second walk from Aunt Mimi's house, John's Aunt Mimi Mendips, on Menlove Avenue. And strangely, Eleanor's house has 2 front doors, one on Menlove Avenue, one around the corner on Vale Road. So I wonder if Eleanor knew Auntie Mimi, and maybe her name came up in conversation in front of John and Paul.
That would be another interesting time.
If they were neighbors on 30 seconds apart, they couldn't have been more than 4 houses apart, probably, because they were, they were semi-detached, weren't they, those houses? Yeah. So 30-second walk would probably be a neighbor 3 or 4 doors down.
That's right.
Amazing.
Okay, Miss Marple.
And sorry, we could also probably speculate that Eleanor Rigby herself might have strolled through the grounds of Strawberry Field.
Oh, I'm sure she would
have. So close to Menlove and, to all of that.
Oh, I'm sure she would have. That was the local park, wasn't it? If you lived on Vale and Menlove, that would have been your local walk in the woods. Absolutely.
Right. Yeah.
So I'll tell you what else I wanted to know, Doug. In addition to being an author, you're also a lawyer. So what was the big lawsuit that you talked about that dogged John Lennon?
Yeah, so John Lennon wrote the song "Come Together," of course, one of the Beatles' best-known songs, and he borrowed or paid homage, however you want to say it, as songwriters do, to a Chuck Berry song from the 50s called "You Can't Catch Me," and it had a line about "Here come a flat top," and Chuck Berry said he's grooving up on me, and John borrowed that theme for the opening of "Come Together." So according to published interviews and articles about it, Paul had said to John, "That's a little close to Chuck Berry. You might want to change that, put a little distance between this song and Chuck Berry's composition." So John changed the feel of it. It had, more of a groove and not, changed the tempo a bit and all of that. So the song comes out, and to John's misfortune, at the time, the copyrights to Chuck Berry's catalog are owned by this notorious music industry figure named Morris Levy, or Mo Levy. And it's later proven that Mo Levy has ties to the New York area mafia, to the Genovese crime family, and he's a connected guy, right? So he's a tough guy.
His Rolodex contains a lot of last names that end in a vowel.
Lots of ending in vowels with his circle. That's right. And so Mo Levy, through whatever means, guys like Mo Levy end up holding copyrights of composers' songs, is holding the copyrights to much of Chuck Berry's catalog. And he sees a shakedown opportunity when he sees one, and he goes after John, interestingly, just John, for copyright infringement based on his holding the rights to "You Can't Catch Me." Now, one question, and Tom Frangione actually asked this question, and I researched it and put it in the book. All the compositions of the Beatles, of John and Paul at that time, were Lennon and McCartney.
Right.
So why did Paul not get dragged into this, this pain in the butt litigation? And it turns out that, of course, at the time, the Beatles were having a split over whether the Eastmans or, Alan Klein would represent them.
Right.
So Paul didn't sign up with Alan Klein, but he went with the Eastman family, with the Lee and John Eastman. And it was the Eastmans that actually obtained what at that time lawyers in the UK would call a warrant, or we'd call an affidavit from John saying, "This was all me. It was my composition. I take responsibility." So basically, Lee Eastman got John to sort of indemnify or to agree that this was all on him.
Get Paul the golden ticket.
Gave Paul a golden ticket. So score one for the lawyers there. But
yeah, absolutely.
So Paul was sort of able to get extricated from this mess. But so there's this long, tangled, convoluted series of occurrences that could seemingly only happen to John Lennon. And somebody comes up with a creative way to settle this dispute. And that creative way is that John will record on his next album 3 songs from the Chuck Berry or from the Morris Levy catalog. And the sales of that record will amply compensate Mo Levy for his troubles. Right. Well, John's next album is being produced by Phil Spector, who goes all Phil Spector. And
goes all Phil Spector on you. Yep.
And disappears with the masters. And so in the intervening period of time, John releases another album, Walls and Bridges, and the songs are not on it. So Mo Levy sues John again. Right. So it's a whole mess. And John, Mo Levy basically alleges that they had a meeting in which John gave him the verbal rights to release an album with these oldies. So in the category of, sorry that this story has so many turns, but in the category of no good deed goes unpunished.
Absolutely.
John had come around to record these oldies, and to prove to Mo Levy that he was acting in good faith and he was really working on these songs, he sends Mo Levy like a second or third generation demo of what they were working on in the studio. Nowhere near master quality.
Right.
Mo Levy puts it out on one of those mail order, operators are standing by, and he puts out this shady record with the crappy picture of John, presses these at one of his record plants and advertises it on the New York TV stations.
Oh, good God.
Right. And so Capitol Records goes to, get an injunction. They shut it down. There's a few thousand of these records that are sold. But Mo Levy turns around and sues John, saying he was given verbal permission by John to release this as a record. I mean,
come on. John should have sued him for image and likeness of the photograph on the cover.
The photograph on the cover, and hold on a second. Sorry.
All right. Oh, that would be amazing if you have it somewhere. That would be incredible. Yeah. But it's just always.
I might have taken it home, but so on the cover is this crappy picture from the 60s, long-haired John, not his rock and roll look with the leather and the slick back hair, which is what he ultimately put on the cover of his rock and roll album when he did put his album out of oldies. Wow. So it's just this hastily done, shady,
I know
record. So anyway, there's cross lawsuits now because John turns around and countersues Morris Levy, and it ends up in court, and ultimately John prevails and is awarded not a ton of money. It was less than $100,000, but it was a real vindication. And John's lawyer was Jay Bergen, who just actually put a book out called Lennon and the Mobster and Me, which is a great book. That I recommend highly. But so but the whole affair sort of ties John in to the orbit of this music industry mob figure for almost 10 years.
Oh my God.
And
one of our viewers here today, Megan, Rock Radio Paese, I hope I'm pronouncing your name correctly, Megan. She says she knows the history on Come Together, and of course Mo Levy. She learned it when she interviewed Jay Bergen. So one of our viewers interviewed Jay Bergen, and again, the circle closes.
It does. And Jay's a great guy. I've had the opportunity to meet him and correspond with him and chat with him a few times. And the book is fantastic.
Yeah, well, we're hoping to get him on. We haven't made connection yet, but maybe you can help us do that.
I'd be happy to give you his info.
Good, yes.
Yeah, he would definitely be a fascinating person, having been there at the time, and from a different angle, not from the Mal Evans road manager, all man, Man Friday angle, which Kenneth Womack has written about, comes out in November, and not from a fellow bandmate or a wife or an ex-wife or an ex-girlfriend. When you start to talk to the business people, the publishers and lawyers, you get a whole nother facet of the story.
Absolutely, yeah.
When we were doing some NFT stuff with May Pang a couple of years back, just I know a lot of these stories, but she was in the room when these, legal eagle meetings were going on, and it's a completely different angle. It's amazing.
That's right. And May does figure into the book quite a few times because she was such a direct eyewitness.
Oh yeah.
And I've had, a chance to speak with her about some of these stories as well. And she's great. She's awesome.
She is. She's wonderful.
She's fabulous. She's been out on the road actually with Scott Siegelbaum doing her limited edition art collection stuff, which has been great. She's been on tour all across the country.
That's right.
So when the Beatles were starting out, and John and Paul made a big stand with EMI, a big fuss with EMI about the first single. What was that all about?
Yeah, really amazing that, for people who were, this is at the beginning of the Beatles recording career, and talk about all these business things that happened behind the scenes. The legend sort of is that George Martin, discovered that, he heard something, that he thought was just sellable, and he wanted to sign the Beatles.
He didn't really want them at first.
That's exactly right, Angie. I mean, the real
and they offered them a penny a record. Yeah.
Yeah, the real story is that there was a publishing subsidiary that EMI had.
Sure.
Yeah, and there was a publisher who sort of recognized the potential in their songwriting, and because they were also owned by EMI, he sort of foisted the Beatles onto George Martin, who accepted them. I mean, thank heavens that collaboration happened.
Yeah.
But yeah, so at the time, the Beatles were unproven as recording artists. The best they had was a Decca audition tape and My Bonnie in Germany, so right. Nothing that set the world on fire. And, George Martin just sort of presumed that he would do with the Beatles what he did with his other recording artists, which was, I'll go to Tin Pan Alley, I'll find some songs for you to record. Yeah. I'll tell you what to record, and that's how we'll do it.
Yeah.
And, sorry?
Yeah, no, George was also doing a lot of comedy records in those days too, a lot of spoken word stuff. So he was very connected in both, the theatrical scene and the publishing, the music publishing
and classical
scene,
music
and
too.
Also classical music. So he was definitely the go-to guy at EMI.
He played the oboe himself.
He did indeed.
And in fact, Jane Asher's mother tutored George Martin.
That's right.
In oboe playing.
Yep. Before he was Beatle producer George Martin, and before Jane was dating Paul, Margaret Asher, Jane's mom, was a music teacher, and George Martin was one of her students.
That's right. Yeah. Talk about
do the math on that.
It's crazy. Yeah. But thank heavens that they found George Martin and that George Martin found them, and not just being a record producer, but having such a musical vocabulary.
That's right.
And such a training and talent that he could arrange. He could play parts on the records. He could find the right musicians when they needed orchestral arrangements. So, I mean, thank heavens for George Martin.
That's exactly what a lot of our viewers are saying here. Thank heavens for George Martin. Diana Fimiano is just like, thank God for him. Again, it's like all these people that happen into their life story along the way.
Yep.
It's cosmic. But on this first single, George Martin had gone out and found a song by a really neophyte, brand new songwriter who changed his name and became Mitch Murray, who went on to become a renowned songwriter and won many awards and has written many classic songs. But at the time, he was a brand new songwriter, and he was trying to sell his works through Tin Pan Alley. Right. And George listened to his song, liked it, and took it back, to the Beatles and said, here's your first single. Right. And, I think it's amazing. One of the more remarkable stories is how the Beatles, who had no clout at the time, they had no hits, no gold records, no number ones, nothing that they could throw around, no power, no weight, said, we don't want to record that song. We don't want to put that out. And they did record it. They did a very good, I think it's a great arrangement of the song, and it came out on Anthology. Right. But they really pleaded with George to let them try their own material. And I just think making that stand for
it was amazing at that stage.
Well, but one thing they did know was that they had customers. They knew that whatever they put out, they were going to sell, because the demand was so pent up in England, in Liverpool especially. But all of they knew they had a fan base, but John would always call them customers when he would come to our house occasionally and see all the fan mail in the dining room. He'd say, "Oh, the lovely customers. I wish we could ask them what we should record next, or where should we tour, or where should we go." I mean, he basically was seeing the internet in 1967, the two-way street of communication. But yeah, so I think maybe the chutzpah that they got for putting their foot down saying, no, we don't want to release that song, is because they knew that the suits that EMI hadn't witnessed, the screaming fans in Hamburg and the screaming fans in Liverpool. They knew it didn't matter. They could read the Liverpool phone book and people would buy it.
That's right. That's right. That's a great way to put it. And sure enough, when they made the stand to record their own material and put Love Me Do out as the first single, it did respectably well. It hit number 17. It certainly sold a lot up north. And there was rumors that, Brian Epstein was, buying them all up because his family had the record stores. But that didn't seem to be the case. As you say, they had a built-in demand, at least certainly up north. And the nice thing is that built-in demand gave them a little bit more clout. So then after that, when they wanted to record their own material and they demoed it for George Martin, he made some suggestions, and of course, Please Please Me went to number 1, and that's the ball game. So but just making that stand, at a point when no clout to throw around.
But except the clout was the fact that they knew they had customers.
Yeah, except the customers. Yeah. But that was almost like asking EMI, trust us, people like us,
Yeah.
That particular song that they didn't want to record, didn't they give it to Jerry Marsden?
They did. Yeah. They gave it to,
was it How Do You Do What You Do to Me?
That's right. They ended up shortening. That was the original title that Mitch Murray had given it, and then they shortened it to How Do You Do It. And Jerry and the Pacemakers did take it to number 1. So George Martin was right. I mean, he had a good ear for what would be a hit. But thank heavens that the Beatles had so much faith in themselves. They stuck to their guns about their own songwriting, and they became their own Tin Pan Alley. They were their own.
Yeah, that's right.
It was pretty unheard of, wasn't it? For
absolutely, in the early days. Yes. I tell you what else interested me. You were talking about the background story to the boys losing out so much money on merchandising in the early days.
That's a and I'll tell you, one of the most interesting characters that I met discovered when researching this book was a solicitor, an attorney named David Jacobs.
Yeah.
Now, David knew Brian Epstein, and in fact, both were gay men at a time when homosexuality was illegal.
Absolutely,
100%.
In the UK. So they had to be very, underground about it. And David Jacobs, when Brian, relocated and came down to London and started to become a man of London, David Jacobs sort of introduced him to the people and the places where, he could be himself, and, mostly underground places.
Yes.
So they had that collaboration. They knew each other from that. So Brian was getting all of these requests to put the Beatles images and name on all kinds of merchandise. And Brian saw it as a distraction because he wanted to get them into the movies and make records. And, and concerts, he saw that as the main attraction for the Beatles' fortunes.
It was kind of known as the Colonel Tom Parker model, right? Just follow what Elvis did.
In a way, that's right. And I hope this doesn't sound anti Brian Epstein, because the Beatles,
genius.
He was indispensable to
absolutely genius, and a lovely man.
Yeah, one thing managers never understood at that time, because there was no precedent for it.
No,
the amazing potential of music merchandising, and that didn't come until later. So Brian just sort of told David Jacobs, I'm getting all these requests for merchandise, licensing, just handle it, do what you think is best. So
Yeah.
Brian just sort of took a hands-off approach. David Jacobs knew nothing about it.
Well, there was really nothing to know. There was no model, was there? There wasn't a spreadsheet. You couldn't call Metallica and say, "Hey, how did you do it?"
That's right.
Right?
Or Kiss or something.
They weren't born yet, right?
Yeah, that's right. So David Jacobs became acquainted with a group of businessmen headed up by a guy named Nicky Byrne, who was a real, real hustler, just seemed to really be on the ball with business opportunities. And they formed a company called Seal Tab, which is Beatles backwards.
That's right. Yeah.
And the interesting thing about it is he said David Jacobs sent Nicky Byrne a contract and left the spaces blank for what percentage Seal Tab would have and what percentage NEMS or Brian Epstein would have.
Right.
And he said, you just fill in what you think is best. So Nicky Byrne just kind of went, ha ha ha, 90% for us and 10% for you. And he sent it back to David Jacobs, and David Jacobs signed it and said, here you go.
It was the wrong way around.
And never did Nicky Byrne think in a million years that he would have gone for an arrangement like that. I mean,
Right.
Days it would be if the merchandiser got 20%,
You'd be lucky.
It'd be a pretty good deal. So,
and they'd have to pay for the manufacturing and shipping included in that.
That's right. They'd have all the expense.
Yeah.
So some months later, Nicky Byrne hands Brian Epstein a check, and Brian sort of innocently says, "Oh, okay. Well, thank you. I'll get your cut to you after we process this." And Nicky said, "No, Brian, that's your cut." And it was at that point when Brian sort of realized what he had given away.
Oh,
and estimates are that in modern dollars, they lost about $100 million of.
Oh, that leaves them off.
Income. They felt that one, on merchandising.
Wow. Yeah, Elizabeth's asking, did Brian really take his own life? I don't believe so.
No.
It was accidental overdose. He was a bit of a hypochondriac, and he took a lot of pills for a lot of things.
Yeah, he used to take pills to go to sleep and
pills
to keep him wide awake and so on. I mean, that was a really big-time drug culture in those days.
Oh, yeah.
Everybody was at it.
Well, they were working 24/7 and jet lag and this, that, and the other, and nobody knew how bad pharmaceuticals were for you, because if a doctor gave it to you, it was okay.
Yeah.
Right? And so it was just one of those unfortunate things. I think it was just toxicity.
I'm convinced Brian didn't take his own life, because we all went to Bangor, where the boys were with the Maharishi on Sunday, August 27th.
Yeah. Bank holiday Sunday.
Yeah, that's right. And we spent a little time with them. And then we got in our car to go home. And we were outside in the car. And Paul came out to say goodbye to his dad. Jim wound down the window. Paul stuck his head in the window to say bye-bye. And there was a journalist also called George Harrison from the Liverpool Echo.
Wow.
George Harrison came out of the building on the steps and shouted, "Paul, Brian's on the phone. He wants to talk about the arrangements for coming to see you tomorrow." Now, this is the day.
This wouldn't be a man who was planning to kill himself.
No.
This was like mid to late afternoon. We were driving back from Bangor, Wales, which is about 65, 70 mile trip back to Rembrandt in Wirral. And by the time we got in the house, the phone was ringing.
Yeah.
And it was Louise Harrison, wasn't it?
That's right. And she was on the phone saying, she said, I've just heard on Radio Caroline that Brian shot himself. By nothing further from the truth.
Right.
But it's so often the way when there's a tragedy, ridiculous news comes out, and then it's worse now. It gets spread.
But yes, not an hour and a half, maybe 2 hours, because I think we probably would have stopped for petrol and a cup of tea or a wee or something. But not 2 hours before the news was on the radio, Brian had literally picked up the phone and called North Wales, where the Beatles were, in Bangor University, visiting the Maharishi. So this was not a man in my mind. 2 hours later, he would, or 15, 30, 20 minutes later, he would just suddenly say, "Oh, you know what? Screw it. I'm just going to end it all."
No.
I agree with you 100%. I don't think there's any way that it was an intentional suicide on Brian Epstein's part. And
I think it was just toxicity and stress, and maybe he changed up his pills and he was allergic to one of them, or whatever.
Yeah. But that was also the beginning of this kind of thing happening to so many people in rock and roll, and they just didn't know, I think, at that time.
That's right. Oh, absolutely. Well, that's why there's so many members of the 27 Club, because it all happened at once, right? And they didn't realize. And you know what was interesting about Brian? and Queenie and Clive and the whole family was, yes, Brian was gay, but he was obviously in the closet because of the law.
Right.
But he was also very kind of conservative, traditional Jewish family. Loved adored his mother. She was the Queenie. And I just don't think with his background of his religion and his family upbringing, suicide wouldn't have even been on the cards.
No.
You know?
That makes a lot of sense.
Yeah, I mean, they celebrated the holidays and they were just such a great family. Obviously, they must have known what was going on, but you know, who cares, frankly? If you're a nice person and you do your job, I don't care. You know?
Well said. You know, there's an interesting postscript after Brian, you know, was found dead, that David Jacobs showed up at the house and he officially identified the body for police and kind of became the traffic cop, you know, was handling things at the scene. And David Jacobs had a very interesting ending. He was the lawyer who had handled the merchandising.
Right.
He ultimately was found dead, hanging in his garage a few years later.
Really?
Oh, yeah.
In the midst of a very unusual case where he was representing some criminal defendants, and it was unusual in that he did not normally do that kind of criminal defense work. He had represented Liberace in a famous defamation case. He had done business and civil work, but it was very odd that he was representing some people who had been accused literally of crucifying an interior designer. And not long after that, he himself was questioned by the police in the case. And it was odd he was representing the defendants. And then not long after, while this case was still pending, was found hanging in his garage. So it was a very sad postscript for David Jacobs as well.
But there wasn't very much press about that, as I recall. I think it was just quickly dealt with and put,
Wow.
That I could be wrong. I mean, it's many years ago, and
one of that whole crowd whom I still adore, and I had like my first sort of girly crush on when I was about 6. I was going to marry Peter Brown. Oh yes, I was.
Oh no, you weren't.
Oh no, I wasn't.
Oh no, you weren't.
Whoops.
Oh, well,
okay. Well
we
chosen,
knew,
Ruth.
but she didn't. Yeah.
But again, you know, Peter's very successful in the PR and reputation business in New York, and I think he and Stephen Gaines have another book coming out.
They have. I think it's about next April.
Yeah. So what a again, very kind of old-fashioned, gentlemanly. Always wore a vest with the bottom button undone. Just terribly dapper. You know, I just thought Peter Brown was the bee's knees, and I was going to be Ruth Brown.
Oh, but that was yesterday.
Oh, but that was yesterday indeed. Yeah. Oh my God.
No.
So speaking of people that I was going to grow up and do things with and never did, what was the story about a condom getting Paul deported from Germany?
So when the Beatles went to Hamburg, you know, they were living in squalor. I guess there's really no other way to say it in the back of the band.
Dirty mattresses and ugh.
Yeah, they were lucky if they had mattresses. They were sleeping on old couches and things like that.
Yeah.
And so they had an opportunity to sort of play in a better club, which they were aspiring to do. And as they were leaving, and they were breaching a contract, by the way, so they certainly were not keen on the business aspects of their affairs at that time.
Sure.
Certainly, but they left the Bambikino, and they had all left at different times. And when Paul and Pete were leaving, because Pete was still in the band at that time, the stories have differed over the years about their motivation. At one time, I think half snickering, they said, you know, oh, we lit a condom because it was the only thing around, and we needed some light so we could see what we were packing.
Yeah, I've heard that one.
I'm not sure how long a condom is going to burn brightly enough that you could, you know, do your business.
And then when you drop it, what happens amongst a littered floor?
And then what happens? So, and Paul has said, well, we sort of did it as a prank. You know, we're out of here. We're on to better things, and you know, off we go.
Whoops.
But the bottom line is they stick a condom, which Pete Best has confirmed was not, how do I put this, used.
Oh, thank God.
Not secondhand.
Oh,
Not secondhand. That's a better way to
only
say it.
one previous owner.
Yeah.
And they tack it to the wall, light it, leaves a little mark, and on they go. And apparently it's a cinder block wall, not that anything could have burned. So they're turned in by the owner of the club, who's unhappy that they're leaving and breaching their contract to play at his club.
Herr Bruno Kuchschmeider.
Yeah, Bruno Koschmieder. And he says, well, they've, committed arson, and he turns them in. And, ultimately Paul and Pete are deported, and they're taken to the airport and put on a plane, which, according to my research, was the first time either of them had flown. And they're sent back to England, and John had already been back, and George had earlier been deported because he was underage. He was still 17. And George was kind of relieved because he got deported and they were still trying to have a go without him. Yeah. And then all this happened, and he felt like, oh, good, the band is back together.
Boys are back.
And but
the band back together.
Yeah.
Paul and Pete had spent the evening as hosts of the German authorities in a local jail before they were deported. But yeah, so this little prank, sort of a childhood, boyhood, teenage prank of lighting a condom, gets him deported from Germany.
My German husband's upstairs yelling, "Papers!
Show me your papers!
Show me your papers!"
And between Alan Williams and then when they were off to Brian Epstein, they sort of had to pull some strings to get back into Germany for the next residency. And they had to sort of satisfy the German authorities that they weren't, there to burn down.
Fire to anything.
The Reeperbahn was safe, despite the fact that the Beatles were back.
I mean, not to discount your research or Ashley saying it left a smudge on the wall, but Elizabeth has a good point. She said anyone got a condom I can torch right now, because she thought condoms melted.
Oh, really, Elizabeth? Let's talk later.
Yes, indeed. I think
I feel like we have to redo this experiment.
I think so.
I think that's more to do with friction than firelight, my darling. But anyway, you just
go
never
to your room.
Go to your room. So this is just, thank you so much. I know how busy you are in your legal eagle professions. Thank you so much for taking all this time today. Tell the kids where the website is scrolling across the bottom. If you haven't been paying attention, you can rewind when this is on YouTube in about 30 minutes at the TeaFlix YouTube channel. Tell the kids where they can go and avail themselves of this fabulous book.
Sure. Thank you. It's fabbuttrue.com. That's my website. You can get signed copies on that site, and you can get the regular old unsigned copies at Amazon, Barnes & Noble, all the other places you buy books online. The official release in the UK and Europe is October. But in North America, it's out and about. So, but you can visit, like I said, fabbuttrue.com.
Great.
And I'm happy to sign them and send them out. And
it gets the possible number of four thumbs up from the McCartney girls. It's just, it's great. It's a book that reads itself, I'm sure. I've skipped through it when over the weekend when Andrew was filing and doing other stuff. I'm like, I need to read this before Tuesday. So I'm very glad to be able to get my hands on it starting today.
But before you go,
nobody escapes without a limerick. Paul Moody, are you still watching?
Moody's on.
Moody's on. Good.
Okay, fine.
So we usually screw this up the first time, but if we do, we'll do it again. So 1, 2, 3. Doug's knowledge is really quite brightening. His research is so I told you. Do it again.
One more time from the top.
1, 2, 3. Doug's knowledge is really quite brightening. His research is so thorough, it's frightening. But with his expertise, he has made it a breeze with results that were really enlightening.
Ta-da!
And there it is. And you can...
I won't give up my day job.
No,
don't worry.
Please don't.
I love it.
But thanks so much for sending us this. It's a treasure in our McCartney LA library here that we have. And I'm so glad you are a Beatle fan and took the time to write this book, because it's just such a great another angle. And,
yes, it is fabulous.
And
I can't even begin to tell you how thrilling this was and how much I talked to the two of you.
Well, if I need any legal representation, I'll be in touch.
Yeah, I'm not sure what I don't think he does your kind of law, Mrs.
Oh, what a shame.
I'll learn to do your kind of law.
That's a good boy. That's a clever boy.
And in closing, also just a big hug and a heartfelt mwah to Tom Frangione
Yes.
at this particular time. He's just suffered a loss, and amazing forward by him. So Tom, if you get a chance to watch this, we're sending you love and light from ours to yours.
God bless.
All right. Well,
Bye-bye.
great. Go visit fabbuttrue.com and we will see you all of a sudden next week. Ciao, ciao.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.